in this year's CAP filing also, the CAP registrations, the USCIS received a huge number of applications this year, or the registrations this year. First, I want to congratulate to all those who got picked in the lottery. We are expecting USCIS would have received more than 300 to 325,000 registrations. They haven't released the numbers yet, but they would have got a very large number of registrations. And that's the reason why this year, the pick rate for most of the companies was 25% or less. I'm not ignoring the fact that there were multiple registrations, not just the change because of the new administration. Yes, people are optimistic that there will be a lot of changes, but yes, people do file through multiple companies too. But the difference that I saw this year from the previous years or previous administration was that many registrations were done to bring people from outside the US. Where in the past few years, it was most of the filings were for the F1 students. So that was a big change that we have seen this year. Since there was multiple registration, there are high chances that one person was picked up and through multiple companies. So for those who are not selected in the lotteries, please hang in tight. There is a chance that the USCIS will put a second lottery, maybe in the month of August, and we might see more numbers, more people getting selected at that point. So that's a good news on the, and that's a news on the registration. And one thing which happened 2 days back on 31st is that the prior administration's executive order, which is a travel ban on the non-immigrants, the new administration let it expire. There was a sunset on that, which was March 31st. So that expired on March 31st. Now the H-1B holders and all other non-immigrant visa type holders, they can apply for a visa at the consulate and travel back to the US. And the Department of State has already informed that those who had the visa rejections because of the travel ban, they can reapply with new fees. So that's a very good news for those people who are stuck outside the US. And even starting on the 1st itself, we started sending emails for those who are stuck on with 221Gs in the consulates. And what we saw that because of the travel ban has expired, the consulates started sending, after receiving our email, sending emails to the candidates, the visa applicants, to submit their passport. So asking them to drop off the passport. So which is also again a positive thing. And we are hoping that there will be more visa slots opened up in the next few weeks, and people will be able to apply for the visa and come to US. Another major event that is going to happen is the priority dates of the immigrant visas, the opportunity for everyone to file 485. The priority dates are going to move drastically in the month of October this year. So we'll talk more about that in the Q&A session, how to get ourselves prepared. And for those people who have filed also, we will talk about that, what the priority date moves means to them. So that is another positive change that we have seen coming in. So there are a lot, but we'll talk more about that in the Q&A, Vinay.
Thank you, Thomas. Thank you for a nice brief. And rather, I have a question related with that lottery. You said there will be a probably second chance, right? Okay, yes. Hopefully sometime in September, October, right? Yes. So based on your experience last year, right? Mm-hmm. What do you think was the number which happened last year? So that is it going to be some 15,000 or 20,000 or 10,000? What were the numbers last year in the second chance?
My guess is would be as good as yours in this. It's very difficult because USCIS, when it comes to the lottery, there is no transparency. Last year, we applied for a Freedom of Information Act. I wanted to see how many people have applied for multiple petitions, registrations through different companies. Mm-hmm. They rejected it. So then the next option would be for us to file a litigation, because we wanted that statistics to see whether the system has been abused or not. So, thing is, there is no transparency in that. But I'm assuming there would be a good number, maybe it's 10,000, 15,000. But last year also, many people got selected in the second slot. So there is an opportunity there.
Yeah, even we got some numbers in the second lot. So that's
Yes.
why, it was surprising, but we got some number, which was good, right?
Yes.
Okay, let's go to our first session, that is on I-485, I-140 filings, denials, and visa-related protections. Okay, so let me take the simpler question rather. On the visa movement, what is that you are expecting to happen in October, and why it happens in October? What is the reason behind that it will happen? Because do they release some new quota or what?
October is the start of fiscal year 2022. So for immigration, the fiscal year starts on October 1st. That's why the CAP H1s have a start date of October 1st. So that's where, when the Department of State, they look into the numbers, how many visas should be allotted to each country, how many have been used in the previous years, how many is left unused, and they make those changes, the number moving during this October 1st. So how this prediction came out was last month when there's a guy with the Department of States, who is the Charlie Oppenheim. He is the guy who assigns the visa numbers at the Department of State level. He is the chief of immigrant visa control and reporting division of Department of State. He's been working there forever, from 1978 onwards. So for the first time, Department of State, they released a podcast. It's there in the YouTube for the April bulletin. So what he did, what he said during the podcast was, there is at least 275,000 employment-based visas available for the next fiscal year. How this happened was because of this travel ban on immigrant visas. On the family side, there were very few who used during the last fiscal year. The consulates were closed. There was a ban. So there were very few family-based visa numbers used. So what happens is, if for the last fiscal year, there is numbers left for the family-based, it falls onto the next year's employment-based. So employment-based per year has, for EB2, EB1, EB2, EB3, they have only 140,000. But because of this family-based overflow, there is at least 270,000 visa numbers, which means that in October 2021 bulletin, you will see the numbers advancing, moving forward.
So what you're saying here is, if you have a 140 approval through your employer, and if you are thinking of changing employment and risking the I-140 approval, they need to start over all over again. It's not a very good idea at this time, because the numbers are likely to move forward.
So one good thing that happened is we got a heads up saying that the numbers will move. So what that means for the beneficiaries, the applicants, is that whoever is having an I-140, this same question came up last October also, EB2 to EB3. Now you don't have to wait for the October bulletin to come. So if you have an EB2, you can start downgrading it at now. You don't have to do it on October 1st and file it concurrently with 485. There are a couple of benefits of that. One is, last year we had a question whether it should be a downgrade or it should be an amendment, or a downgrade should be an amendment, or it should be a new employment. I was always advising everyone to do as a new employment, but some companies wanted an amendment because there was a rumor going on that if it's a new employment, all these I-140s will be returned. Nothing happened like that. This year, again, it's too early, but there are many I-140s where we are getting approvals, RFEs, people are upgrading to premium. So a lot of things are happening. So we don't have to risk that at the time of 485 filing. If the applicants, if the employees, they start downgrading right now, because then we don't even know whether it's EB2 or EB3 which is going to move forward. So by having two I-140s approved under EB2 and EB3, if they can be ready at the time of October and choose which one they want to proceed with. So that opportunity, they are getting it right now. So I would say talk to their employer and see the option of filing another I-140 on the approved perm itself. Even if the perm has expired, you can still downgrade from EB2 to EB3. For people who don't have an EB2, maybe it's time for them to think about it and start a new employment-based EB2 application.
Thomas,
So
What is your
sorry.
yeah, what's your advice for people having 140 approval, and if they have 140 approval to the current employer, stay put, wait for the numbers to be current. If you don't have the 140 approval, get it filed as soon as possible, and port it so that you're ready for 485. Is that your advice?
Yes, exactly. If you have a I-140 pending, this may not be the time to move around, because then you will miss the bus for the 485.
Yep.
If you have an application pending, a perm pending, if there is some delay, push it, get it filed by October. If you get an approval, you can file the I-140 and 485 together. Another thing is, if you have a EB2 which is ready to be filed right now, the perm is certified, not just EB2, file EB2 and EB3 at the same time on the same perm. That is also a possibility. So instead of, there is no question of downgrading and all at that point, you can file both on the same perm. The IT industry, we never used to do that a lot, but in the other industries, they used to file both EB2 and EB3 on the same perm at the same time. So I think this is high time we start doing that way and start thinking of it.
Can we do that only when the labor is current, or can we do it on expired labors?
So after on an expired labor, then it becomes a downgrading. So on a valid labor, if you can file both at the same time. And if you're not filing at the same time, then if the labor has expired, then the only option is downgrading.
See, that is the benefit of joining wonderful sessions like this with great people like you. Thank you. Vanessa, please go ahead.
Yeah, Thomas. So the question, since I think Suresh raised a very important point, a person is working with a company, his I-140 is approved, right? Okay. So his question was whether he should think of moving now, because the chances are the visa numbers may become current and it will be easier for him to get a 485J from the current employer, right? So my question is, who issues the 485J and what is the disadvantage of moving if your I-140 is approved and visa numbers become available then, right?
Okay. Yes, these are two separate issues. One is, if you have an I-140 approved, this may be the time to stay put and not move around. The reason is the October is right around the corner. If you are transferring to another employer at this point, if they're going to start from the scratch, your perm is not going to be certified before October. So it may not be a time to change the employer for this reason. But again, you have to weigh in other reasons too. But priority date is one thing that matters. If you have a priority date of 2018-19, maybe it might not become current. I have no clue how far it will move, but in those cases, the priority date might not move till that. So that's a different case. Now, when it comes to the 485J, that applies to people who have already filed 485. So I'm assuming this is question about ASC 21 porting. The people who have already filed for the 485, their 6 months have passed after filing the 485. For them, even if they want to move out, I would suggest move out only after the I-140 is approved, so that even if your prior employer withdraws that, even before the I-140 is approved, because so many downgrades happened previously. So if the employer withdraws the I-140, it might complicate your 485. So wait until it gets approved, and then after 6 months is passed from the date of filing of the 485, you can move port it to another employer by just filing the 485J.
So to conclude, a 485J, in case you have already filed 485 and 6 months have passed, under AC 21 rule, it can be issued by the second employer also, new employer, right? So that's correct.
So that's supporting so this 485J is the bona fide job offer. It's more porting to another employer. So you file the 485J, it has to be signed by the employer, it has to be signed by the employee, and it should be in the same or similar position. So you mention all these details on the 485J and file it, you get a receipt notice, and later get an approval notice on the 485J. That's how the porting gets approved.
485, so that means the new employer responsibility is only to basically sign the 485J. He doesn't have to do anything else, right? Once a person is using the AC21, right?
There's nothing for him to do. It can be even a future employer too. You need not be working with that employer as of now to have the 485J file. So the only thing is it's a bona fide job offer that once you get the permanent position approved, that you will start working with that employer.
Okay. Okay, there are some questions which I've seen, couple of questions which have come. I'm just picking up some of them, which I read actually. They're saying they filed I-485 and I-140, concurrently, but they got a receipt for I-485, but not for I-140. Is it happening like that?
USCIS is also making some errors. So what has happened is when we filed in October, with lock boxes like Texas or some other place, they dumped everything in a warehouse, huge warehouse, and they did not look back to that for months. So what has happened is where the downgrades and 485s were filed together, it got separated. And they issued a receipt notice on 485, but rejected the I-140 for some reason. So if the underlying petition, there were some errors and they had rejected it, if they received the 485 and they issued a receipt notice, that is invalid. It happened. We saw some rare cases like that, but they have to go back and check the whole I-140 file and review it if there is any reasons for the rejection. And if I-140 got rejected, I-485 got accepted, that got accepted in error, and it will be denied eventually, because the underlying eligibility petition is not there.
You're thinking if they didn't get the receipt notice that maybe I-140 is being rejected, is it?
Yes, that could be. I don't know exactly when they filed, but most of the cases, I would say 99.5% of the cases that we filed, everything got received notice, which were filed until December. So it could be, unfortunately, this would be those few cases where things have been either returned for some reason.
So since we're talking about rejection, people are getting rejections of, applications for various reasons, 485 application, right? Okay. And so, basically some of them are clerical errors. So what kind of errors you have seen, Thomas, on 485 rejections, and what kind of, things, the employees need to do or the employer need to do to rectify those, right? There are a lot of questions on that actually, right?
So this year, I've heard that there were a lot of rejections. Our office had very few rejections, negligible. One of the major reason for rejection was the wrong checkbox on item number 2, which is the eligibility to file the petition, and especially for the spouses, because there were no proper directions from the USCIS as to what to put in there. So there were a lot of rejections on that part. Then the wrong checks, the incomplete forms, missing signature, and there were cases where they rejected for missing pages. But when the applicants or the law firms filed it, the pages were there. But at the warehouse, they misplaced the pages, and for many reasons they rejected it. So these were some of the major reasons, and wrong checkbox was the main reason for rejection. But the prior rule was that from 2016, where the rule came out that if you are refiling a petition, you don't retain the original date which you filed the first petition. So what happens is when when USCIS returned it after 2-3 months, they returned it after December when the priority date is not current. And many of these people, when they send it back, the priority date is not current. And the USCIS will not retain the first filing date. So what happened? They rejected back again the application because the priority date is not current. Luckily, USCIS made one exception to this rule. They said that if the 485 is rejected for the checkbox on part 2, which is the eligibility, and if you file between October 1st and December 31st and you got the 485 rejected, refile it and we'll accept it. And they started issuing this letter to all those cases which were rejected. So luckily, they opened up for one specific reason and they are accepting it back. But if it is for other missing information or wrong amount in the check or missing pages, no, unfortunately, they missed the bus.
Thomas, one guy has asked about 9089, that it was rejected because in the downgrade I-140 application, they didn't enclose ETA 9089, right? So will that rejection can be, kind of taken care of?
Unfortunately, that cannot be rectified. For the I-140 eligibility, the ETA 9089 is one of the major documents. So if they missed it, unfortunately, they missed that deadline.
Sorry.
Yeah, Thomas, there is a related question regarding this with respect to EB2 I-140 downgrade. The question from HR manager Ram regarding employees Hari and Binod. They file EB3 downgrade concurrently with the I-485. They want to find out the possibility for filing premium processing on the I-140 downgrade. Did anyone see success with the filing?
Yes.
Our premium processing?
Yes, our office has filed a lot of upgrades to premium processing right now, and USCIS either is approving or issuing RFEs on that. So we have got a lot of approvals on that, but there is a lot of RFEs on ability to pay, but nothing else, but which is much more manageable.
Okay, there are a couple of more questions that we received from the emails.
Yes.
So if we can answer them now.
Yes.
There's a question from HR manager Kalyani regarding employee Arvind. I filed my 485 and wife is on H4. Because of the uncertainty in H4 delays, we filed both H4 EAD and I-485 EAD for her. If we get both EADs, which one will be valid for employment?
Okay.
H4 EAD or I-485 EAD? Which one can be used for employment?
That's actually a tricky question for all of us. The reason is earlier days, before the H4 EAD was implemented by Obama administration, if you use the EAD, the 485 EAD, you lose H4 status. The reason is you are not supposed to work on a H4. H4 didn't have a work authorization, so you will lose the H4. But when Obama administration implemented this H4 EAD for H4s, the original rule didn't change as of now on the books, which they were that the H4 will be gone. But we should assume that they will not lose the H4 status because now they have a H4 EAD work authorization. They can work on H4 also. But on a safer side, I would suggest if you are using 485 EAD, don't use the H4 EAD because the black and white rules have not changed though when the H4 EAD was implemented.
So the first preference would be to use 485 EAD.
485 EAD.
What if the employee travels abroad and goes for the H4 visa stamping, gets the H4 visa stamping and comes back? Will the I-485 EAD be invalid or valid or?
No, that's a good question. So now they are back on H4 status. So they can use the H4 EAD at that point.
Okay. What if they travel on parole visa? When they come back, they don't get H4 visa stamping and they come back on parole visa. Can they
they
use the for EAD then or no?
they are parolee at that point. So there are two things here. One is the H-1B traveling on adverse parole and coming back, and the H-4 traveling out and coming back on parole status. So the basic rule is if anybody travels out, a non-immigrant visa holder travels out and come back to the US on advanced parole, they lose the non-immigrant status. The exception is H1 and L1s, which has a dual intent. But the rule says, not the rule, there was a memo from 1993, if I'm not wrong, which says that a person who re-enters the US, H-1B holder who re-enters the US on advanced parole can file for an H-1B extension. So what is assumed or presumed from that is that if he can extend H-1, he should be maintaining the H-1B status while he entered on the parole status. So, but the rules are not written. What we suggest all those applicants who travel and come back on advanced parole is go and file an H-1B reinstatement. So in 2017 and 2007 and 2012, when the priority dates moved, like this October, and many people filed 485s, when they all traveled and came back to the US on advanced parole, once they entered the country, we filed for a reinstatement of their H-1. It is more like an H-1B amendment, where the I-94, you're asking them to amend it to H-1B, which shows a parolee status.
Thomas,
So,
I have a follow-up question here.
yeah.
Can you do this if you change the employer? Let's say you went back to, you traveled on advanced payroll, but you came back, but you joined some other employer. So that employer can file your H-1B now a transfer? I don't think so. No.
No, this is when they come back for the same employer who filed the I-140.
Okay, because this is one question somebody is asking, that they travel, I think this is a very important question to keep in mind. You can't maintain a dual status if you travel on advanced payroll and you come back on a different employer, right?
Yes.
That is very, very
on
important.
the same employer that you should be traveling, you should be coming back to.
I think this first session itself is taking too much of time. So I'll ask just one more question on that. What is there's a lot of question related with delays on EAD card. Do you have any update on that, Thomas?
If it's employment-based EADs, for the 485s that we file, people are already received their EADs, most of them. But there are some cases where the biometrics have not been issued to the applicants. So for some people, there is some delay. We have been following up. So, and we are seeing some results saying that the biometrics has been issued. So yes, not much delay for the employment-based side. But if you are asking about H-4 EADs, the recent filings, we are seeing that they're getting approved in 8 to 9 months. But there are H-4 EADs that is pending from more than a year now. And there are cases which is pending for 16 months without even biometrics on the H-4.
Okay, thank you, Thomas. Thank you for this very good session. I think very good question Suresh ji asked also, right? Okay, some of them very deep questions rather, right?
I know.
And,
yes.
Let's go to the next session. We'll see if we get some time later on, then we'll try to come back to 485 because that seems to be having lot of questions,
Yes.
right? And so now let's move to the cap filing, denials and re-adjudication. There are two things I want to discuss in this. One was that there was a recent, announcement by USCIS that they are going to reopen the cases, or the denied cases, right? Okay.
Yes.
So can you just give us what cap years can be reopened? Okay. Sure. And
so yeah. This memo which came out recently, a few days back, that's not just on cap alone. So if you had a denial for 3 reasons, you could reopen. So before telling those 3 reasons, just to give a history about those, we all know that for the last many years, the USCIS has been denying the cases for this employee-employer relationship. The lack of client letter or for inability to give a contract between the prime vendor, the client. Or they were denying for specific language in the client letter regarding who controls the employee, and various other right to control issues. So, and there were also denials for specialty occupation base for the computer programmer positions also. This was based on the 2017 memo. So the first one, this is the contracts and the employer-employer relationship. Yeah, we all know that because of the ITserv case, it was overturned and USCIS withdrew all those memos. And recently, the USCIS withdrew the 2017 memo for the computer programmer position too. Now, a couple of days back, USCIS came up with a new memo where they said that if you got rejection for these three reasons, one is the employer-employer relationship, second is the specialty occupation for computer programmers, and third, the third is for the contract and the itinerary, you can file a motion to reopen, and the USCIS will reopen and approve those petitions. So the approval is not automatic. The employers have to file I-290B along with the fees, and USCIS will reopen and approve those petitions. That's a major change from our major move from the USCIS side, because they are accepting their mistake, which they have done. But it comes with one caveat, that if you are filing the MTR, you cannot file the MTR if your LCA has expired in the denied petition, or the validity period that you are requesting, that has expired. So if the petition validity date is expired, the LCA has expired, you cannot file for an MTR. But a litigation may be an option if the two conditions doesn't meet. Like if it has expired or the LCA has expired, you can file a litigation and you can still get an approval. And many of you might ask, why do we need an approval if the validity is gone? Now, there are cases that came to me recently where the beneficiary filed a CAP petition 4 years back, and they got a denial for employer-employer relationship. Now, if you are filing a litigation and getting that approved, he will have an approval notice and he will be counted in the CAP. So there are instances where a litigation would help even if the validity is over.
Yeah, this is actually very important point for all the listeners, that, you know, in case you have any denial which happened because of in the CAP case particularly, and, you know, and if you have not been able to go through a lottery during this, you know, period of last 2-3 years, then this may be your best chance to, maybe if you can talk to your employer and get in touch with them and see if they will be ready to file an MTR or a litigation on your behalf, so that if they can, you know, get it approved, right, in that case, you will be able to get through the lottery. So this could be a very interesting point.
And another challenge for this is sometimes many of the denials which came to me now for filing a litigation or for filing an MTR is, it's not just pure employee-employer relationship. And it was coupled with a specialty occupation also. In that case, filing this under the new memo may not be feasible. So there also, I was giving them the option to file the MTR, so that to file the option to litigate it, which they have a higher chance of approval for other issues are involved in that.
Thank you, Thomas.
What's the time frame for MTR and what is the time frame for litigation?
So MTR will obviously take 8 to 12 months, but the litigation, if it is just a pure one of these three grounds, I think the government will not litigate it, so they will just approve it, which would be less than 60 days.
Okay, that's good. 60 days. That's good. Thomas, a couple of questions related with the current CAP now. Okay. And, you know, I'm sure there are a lot of duplicate submission, right? Right. Happened, right?
Yeah,
okay.
A lot.
So there are two questions related to those submissions, right? I mean, this will be important for employer and employees both, right? That how to withdraw safely from a duplicate, you know, when you don't have you can't file the H1. That is one question, maybe because of duplicate submission or with some other reason. And second related question is, if you get an RFE on a duplicate submission, then how to handle it?
Yes. So Yeah, I'll split it. So if there has been duplicate registration, not duplicate H1B filing. If there is two companies that has filed for one person and both get selected in the registration, there is no way to withdraw one. You have to just let it go one, or file through both. But here, filing through both will lead to duplicate filing if it is a related company or same or similar position. Now, the issue comes up if two companies are filing the H1, a duplicate filing of H1, not the duplicate filing of registration. Duplicate filing of registration, the issue will come up if one company doesn't file, then they have the company which doesn't file after getting selected, they might have consequences. But when both the petitions are selected, and if both the companies are filing the petition, there could be possible issues in that. One is, same company cannot file two petitions, that everybody knows, because you won't even reach that stage, because that the registration stage itself, it gets denied. Now, if two related companies, common ownership or affiliate company, subsidiary company are filing two petitions, then those companies have to prove why, if there is any business need for the two companies to file the H1. And that standard is very difficult. So if two related companies are filing it, there is a high chance that it will get denied. We remember getting both the cases approved for one of the cases where the contract with the client for one of the companies was expiring, and the reason what we give for filing the other H1 through the related company was that there is a non-compete reasons, and that's the reason they don't want to extend this contract and filing through the other company, and USCIS approved it. But the standards are very high, it will not get approved. Now, if two companies are unrelated and they are filing for one beneficiary, it happens, I'll give an example. If the vendor is filing for the same client and employer is also filing for the same client, now both, there is a similarity in filing, same client, same title, same job duties. So USCIS, though these companies are unrelated, USCIS will treat them acting in concert, and they will deny it. But they will give an RFE asking the employer to prove that they were not acting in concert or they are not related companies, and why the similarity and all. It is very difficult to prove, but we had a similar case where the vendor went and filed a case, H1B, also without the employer knowing. And as the employer, they went, and there was a non-solicitation clause. The vendor was not supposed to file. So they sent a legal notice to the vendor. They put that legal notice in the RFE and showed that both the companies are not related. And the second filing was without their knowledge, and they are going legal against that company, and they got it approved. So if two companies are filing, and if both the jobs, there is a similarity, there is a high chance that you will see a denial.
Thank you, Thomas. I think we will probably talk about CAP, season, the new CAP season, maybe next time, because we don't know what is going to come right now. But you are expecting a lot of approvals coming soon. I mean, after we, of course, submit the applications, right?
Yeah,
Actually.
I mean, the approval rate is very high, very less RFP. So I don't think any reason why people would get denial unless USCIS changes the policy.
Okay. So let's move to the next topic, because I think we have plenty of questions which are still pending on 485 and I-140, and I want to leave some time for the audience in the end to cover some of those, right? Okay, but I'll keep calling them, or Mr. Suresh can call in between some of those questions. But we will continue with our next topic, that is H-1B visa transfers. So there was a, sorry. So, on H-1B visa transfers, now you don't see many denials as such, right? Okay. But there has been cases where denials do happen, right?
Yes,
Okay. So there are two scenarios. And can you transfer an H1 if, your, H1 has been denied, but I-94 is not expired? And second case, if I-94 is expired, then what, can you do it or not, right?
So possible scenario, a company has filed for an extension and the prior H1 I-94 has expired. Now he's in the US on that pending extension. That's called a bridge filing. Now, while that extension is pending, another employer is trying to transfer him to his company. Now, what happens is that period that the beneficiary stays after the I-94 expiry and while the receipt notice is pending, that is the period what we call posse bag, which is the period of stay authorized by the Attorney General. So this is more of a technicality. During that period, he has a valid stay, but he doesn't have a valid status. So he can stay in the country, but he doesn't have a status to transfer it to another employer. That's a technicality in that. So what it means is, while this bridge petition is pending, which is the extension petition is pending, if an employer transfers to another company, and if the extension petition gets denied, the transfer petition will get approved without the I-94. So, or even if the prior employer withdraws the petition also, the bridge breaks and the H-1B, the transfer will get approved without the I-94. But the beneficiary will get the transfer employer will get an RFE. During this pandemic, one good thing what happened was, in similar situation, we requested the USCIS to exercise its inherent powers and then approve it, because they have discretionary powers. So to approve it with the I-94 so that the beneficiary doesn't have to travel during the pandemic. And they were very accommodative, and USCIS approved many petitions with the I-94. If it wasn't a normal case, they will not have approved it with the I-94. So that is one thing. Now the second scenario is the most dangerous one, like what you asked me. If a person files for a transfer after the I-94 expires, there are two problems here. One is he cannot work on a receipt notice. To work on a receipt notice, the petition has to be timely filed. Now the original petition has been denied, the I-94 expired. When the transfer employer files a transfer, it's not timely filed. So he cannot work on a receipt notice. Now the second problem is he files for the transfer, and after 8 months it gets approved without the I-94, let's assume. Now from the date of denial of the first petition and the second petition which got approved without the I-94, if 180 days has passed, then the beneficiary has a 3-year bar to come back. So many of these people, the beneficiaries who file after the denial, they don't know that there's a potential bar for them if they stay more than 180 days. So that is one of the major challenges that I have seen if you are filing after the transfer, after the I-94 has expired.
Thank you, Thomas. That's very, I think, interesting input, right? And so I think now the other question will be, there is one gentleman who has asked that, I think that question answer should be simple. That's what I feel. But still, let me read out that question to you. And 1 second, I'll just read it out. 1 second, please. I'm with the employer A and got a job offer from employer B. Employer B already transferred my H-1B and I've signed the offer letter with them. Now I'm planning to stay with A. Will there be any legal complication in case I don't join new employer B?
No, there should not be anything. If the I-797 is valid for the employer A and that job offer is still there, you can just go back. So a person can have multiple H-1B approved. There is something called the dormant H-1B rule. So they can switch back between these dormant H-1s. So if company A, he can move back. Even if the company B has started the payroll, he can still go back to the company A without doing nothing.
Okay, there's one question which a lot of people probably may be asking, or a lot of employer may be interested. Everybody's almost working from home nowadays, right?
Yes.
Okay. So can we file a amendment or a extension of H1 based on only home location, saying it's a remote project? Is it a viable?
Yes. If the beneficiary employee is working only from home, yes, you can file just with the home address. But now most of the offices are opening up. There is a plan for people to go back to another to the client location in another 3 months. In that case, I'm just giving an example. If in that case, you can file with both the locations, home location and the client location, because when he moves to the client location, maybe at that point, if it is not within the same MSA, you need not file for an amendment. You can avoid an amendment. But it is absolutely possible. You can just file with the home location alone.
Okay, there is a follow-up question now, and I think this is one from the audience. Because of this working from home location, but a lot of people are taking 2 jobs, right? Okay, so
Yes.
they take one with one employer and they take another one with the another employer, right? Okay,
Yes.
so what is to stay in compliance, what should be done, right?
If with multiple projects, right, there is no rule which says that a person cannot work 80 hours per week. He can work what is humanly possible. If it is the second job is through a different employer, you can file an concurrent H1 through that company also and work on both the projects. With the same employer, if you're doing multiple projects, I would suggest just go ahead and file an amendment, letting USCIS know that he is working on these 2 projects or 3 projects. The reason is, if one of the project on which you file the H1, if that project gets over, and if the site visit happens on that client location, and if they see that he's not working there, and when he comes back to the employee and he says that I'm working on this new project for last 8 months, which the USCIS has no information of, then you might get an intent to revoke. So if you are working on multiple projects, I would suggest go ahead and when you file an amendment, file or with all the clients that you're working with.
Thomas, there's another flavor to this question. We filed the H1 to be working from home. So on the LCA, we have 2 work locations. One is the incline location, and there is the home location, because the pandemic is working from the home location. Now we have another project, but the project is strictly from home. So the same LCA will hold good, right? We can.
The question here is, the second project, does it make the other, is it a material change to the approved petition? So he is working on a different project which was not mentioned in the other H1B. Now, is it the same job title? It's the same job duties. Whether that's USCIS will classify that into a material change or not, it depends, because the material change has not been defined. So the rule is, if there is a material change, you have to file for an amendment. A conservative way of interpreting is, if the project changes, do an amendment. So now there are 2 projects. One is the first, which is there on the H1, and he is working on another project. I would say file an amendment where you include both the projects in there. So even if you have a site visit, you don't have to worry about the intent to revoke.
Thomas, thank you for the question. Since you are talking about site visit, I read one question from audience, and that was that a lot of site visits nowadays. So do you think, do you have that kind of input? A lot of site visits are happening?
So, after the ITserv case, ITserv memo and all this came out, USCIS is approving petitions without client letter, vendor letter, not even without contracts, right? We are all seeing there's a lot of approvals are coming in. So when you file a case without the client letter or vendor letter or a contract, what I have seen is there is a site visit associated with that. They want to make sure that where he's working. And in cases where we put the client letter or the vendor letter, the site visits are very less. So because the approval rates are a lot, people are filing without any of these documents, I'm seeing more site visits. The answer is yes.
Can we take a slight deviation from the question? There's a question from participant Ascent Technologies. Raghu, this is for you, the question. The benefits in joining ITserv Alliance. What are the benefits for ITserv Alliance? We'd like to join ITserv. What is your message for Ascent Technologies?
Okay,
It's a
that's
good question, Suresh.
this is if you are in IT industry, if you are in a IT employer, I think this is employer, right, Suresh?
Right. Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
See, there are a lot of benefits. I mean, we can explain you. We will share our contact details. So we'll Sam can post you our contact details. The biggest difference is you'll be there is a lot of knowledge sharing that happens among 1,200 members, and I'm pretty sure you must have heard how well organized we are looking at these immigration aspects and how we are trying to address these challenges. So I don't want to take away everybody's time, but we have the direct access to the C-level executives of the businesses if you are a member, and we always try to share the knowledge, and we compete, but still the sharing part and keeping togetherness. Just now Thomas mentioned USCIS named a judgment. The file name is ITserv. File name itself has ITserv. That itself shows together how important we are together. Individually, it is very difficult to even ask or to even go and get any questions. So there are a lot of benefits we can explain. There are a lot of activities that we are driving in ITserv. We're happy to explain, and we'll share our contact details. We'll give you more information if you're an employer. I know there are a lot of people who are employee side also joined, and our valuable time from Thomas is very important for us. Thanks.
Thank you, Raghu. Thank you, Raghu. So networking, easy access for attorneys. Together we can make a change, and the lot of knowledge sharing. These are high-level benefits. There are more benefits such as mediation, arbitration, and so on and so forth. And it's the lot. So you can call us and we can explain you. Thank you. Please
It's
go
a
ahead.
collective strength of 1,200 members. That makes us a big force, right? That
Yes.
is what is the big force, and we can then do a lot of things for the benefit of each member, right? So that is our collective strength. Anyway, so Thomas, what are the continuing with this subject? Maybe the last question for this: what are the SOC codes now which are safer?
Okay.
So now a lot of people will be filing the CAP filing. So they, maybe this will be a good question to answer, because what kind of SOC codes are safer to file now?
Yes, I'll keep it very brief because that's a big topic. I can talk a couple of hours on that SOC code because it's connected with the specialty occupation.
Yes.
So I believe all the SOC codes are approvable. It's how you handle it. In the past, there were some titles which were bad or which used to get a lot of RFEs and denials. But with a series of federal court decisions, the service centers have changed the way they used to look at these titles. And now we are seeing a lot of approvals of once what we thought used to be a bad titles, we are seeing a lot of approvals. So a couple of titles where people used to use in the past and not using now are the computer systems analyst, management systems analyst, programmer analyst, market research analyst, all those titles. But I'm seeing that there's a lot of approvals now coming for these titles too. But with the new memo that came out, which took out the programmer analyst or computer programmer memo, now that also became approvable title. So, and when it comes to the market research analyst, which is most people use as an in-house title, there was a class action lawsuit that was filed, and because of that, the market research analyst title has become good now. IT project manager, which is an in-house title, is also, there's a lot of approvals in that. On an IT manager, the problem which I've seen is that the person is outside the US, the consulates are issuing a 221G for most of those titles, and it's taking a longer time. But the usual SOC codes like software developer applications, network administrator, computer occupation, all of this, database administrator, all these are still good and approvable titles with very less RFEs. Computer systems analyst, management analyst, as long as you stick with the basic law, that is when you are filing an H-1B, don't mention all the degrees, all the majors in there. Just stick with one what is mentioned on the Occupational Outlook Handbook. You can get an approval with the any titles, and don't use titles, the degrees like engineering or MBA, because it can be any degree. It's not specific enough. So for those reasons, I feel like you will get an approval if you use any SOC code.
Thank you, Thomas.
Yeah.
Let's move to another hot topic rather before I come to OPT CPT, and that topic is the H4 EAD adjudication delays, right? Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So there are a lot of do you see first any improvement in that, right?
Yes.
H4 EAD issues.
Yes, I do see. So the ones which we were recently filed, I'm seeing approvals coming in 7 to 8 months. That's a good case, what's happening right now. But there are a lot of H4 EADs that has been filed and still pending. So including the student OPTs and H4 EADs and 485 EADs, I heard there is close to 500,000 applications they had once pending. So they are clearing many of those, but there's a huge delay. We have cases that is pending for many months, like 16, 17 months, which have not been approved. And our office is filing a lot of litigation. So if your H4 EAD is pending for more than 6 months, they are just approving it once we file. If we can show any hardship, we are getting it approved quicker.
There was a recent news that H4 EAD automatic 180 days extension may happen. Do you think that is possibility happening soon or no?
I mean, those are rumors. Unless and until I see that written a memo or a change in regulation, that's still just a rumor. So you never know. But they should do that, because many EADs have that capability. If you take OPT EAD or 485, they can work for 180 days. Why not H4s? So that is something that has to be changed.
Okay. So that's fine. Then, now the fingerprinting, some people are probably, getting calls for fingerprinting. Some are not getting called for fingerprinting. So how to, really address that issue, right?
So if the thing, biometrics is for the H4, right? So if they have already given biometrics in a previous application which they were filed, we are seeing that the USCIS is using that biometrics and just approving the H4 EAD. Few cases. Some, what we have seen is the beneficiaries are reaching out to either their congressmen or senators. And once the senator makes the request, then the biometrics is coming fast. So if there are some people out there who have been pending for a very long time, they should reach out to the congressman or the senator. I just have a nurse whose H4 is expiring, and we have reached out to the USCIS, and they were very accommodative because she is treating COVID-19 patients, and we are looking to get that approved, reaching directly to USCIS.
There is a question related to this. Fingerprinting was done in first week of December, but still EAD was not received. Many other people got whose fingerprinting was done in January. There's no further update. Shall we raise a service request? Oh, this is, of course, sorry, this question is for 485, not for H4. Okay. So
yeah, I mean, if on an H4 that is pending, yes, reach out to USCIS and also reach out to your local congressman or a senator, and you should see some action.
Even for 485, what is the time frame after fingerprinting? How much time it is taking to get the EAD?
We have cases where it came in a week time. So there are cases which have been delayed. I would say after the biometrics you have given, and it's more than a month, reach out to USCIS, raise a service request.
Okay. Okay. Yeah. Thank you, Thomas. And I'll come up to some audience question. Sam, if you are there, do you see any Facebook questions? Sam?
Sam is there now. I see
Vinayji, I'll be getting you.
If you see any Facebook question, please feel free to ask in between, right? Okay. Right.
Sure.
because this event is also live on Facebook.
Yes.
So, you guys can ask your question on Facebook as well. And okay, coming to now back to OPT CPT case. Let's look at that a little bit. Okay. There are some, issues related with the, let me ask that question in a multiple question in the same line rather. What is the material change, for STEM OPT case? That's a critical one because recently we have seen a lot of ICE visits, right? Okay. And it's important for people to understand that STEM OPT related material change is very, very important, right? Okay.
Yes.
What is that?
So the rule says if there is a material change with regard to your STEM OPT employment, the employer, the employer and the employee, they should report it to the DSO by filing a I-983 amendment. Now, unlike the H-1B material change on a STEM OPT, there is some clarity where the ICE has explained what all things could be a material change, which is a good thing. So if there is a material change, you have to report it to the DSO. The first thing which they are saying, if there is a change in employer's tax ID number. So if there is a corporate change, if it has been acquired by another company, or if there is a split, or if there is a merger and acquisition that has happened, then you have to inform the DSO. Second is if the wages have been reduced, if there is a reduction in compensation, then that is a material change which has to be reported to the DSO. If the employer has reduced the hours, if there is a significant decrease in hours due to various reasons, pandemic, people became part-time, full-time, became part-time students, there also you will have to inform the DSO. Another thing, what they have said, that if there is any significant change, or if there is a significant change to the initial I-983 that was submitted, then and which includes the employer's commitment to train them or the students' learning objective, then they have to inform them. If the employer is unable to train the student, or the students are unable to attend the training, any of those information that you provided in the 983, which includes a change in work location, change in job duties, all these have to be informed as a material change.
Okay, thank you, Thomas. There's a question, I think, from maybe a foreign national, right? Can a foreign national who is a graduate student on a student visa receive training in a private firm in his or her field of research without CPT? If yes, what conditions should be met?
Yeah, so for a person to receive training, either there should be a CPT or an OPT, curricular practical training or optional practical training. Without that, it's not possible to receive a training while studying. So yes, they have to obtain the training. CPT.
Another question, interesting question. This, probably not related to OPT, CPT, but this is related to E3 visa, right? Yes. Gentleman applied for E3 visa 7 months back. USA is saying processing time is 10 months. Can he work on receipt notice? Okay, or he has to wait for the approval?
No, I will not be the right person on that question.
Okay.
No, you'll have to have an E3 expert on that. I don't want to give an answer. Which
okay. Okay, it was an interesting question, so I asked Thomas.
He can email me. That's fine. I can respond to that.
What we will do is Sam will email you all the questions which we got today, because it becomes our, kind of a database also for us, right? What kind of questions are coming. Yes. And in future, we can select our questions out of this itself rather. They're very, very interesting questions coming from the audience. So I thank all of them. Okay. And we have answered a lot of them, but still, okay. Now there are some questions I will talk about, the US consulate visa appointments, right? Okay.
Yes.
So, there are some questions people are asking, 221G pending for a long time, and, so what they should do. And so can you please give some briefs to people now, of course, that that visa ban has expired, right? Okay.
Yes.
So I have rather two questions on this.
Mhm.
One is now, in case 221G is already pending during COVID times. So what the employer or the employee should do. Second is many employees who have gone to the consulate, they have been asked for the client letter. So what they should do. So these two questions, please try to address.
Well, yes. So one good thing, like I talked about in the beginning, was with the uh, new administration letting the visa ban expire. Now there's an opportunity for everyone to apply for the visa. People who have applied for the visa, many of them, because of the pandemic or because of the executive ban on non-immigrants, they issued 221Gs and they were pending like that forever. Now, since the ban is lifted, this is a good time to do a follow-up with them. If the visa has not been rejected, if it is still on a 221G stage, uh, the emails which we sent yesterday, we got response today, and the visa applicants got a response saying, asking them to submit the passport. So if, because it's been pending for a very long time, so I would suggest for all of them to reach out to the consulate asking for the status, and you will see some action, some movement in that. There are 221Gs. There's almost many cases they are asking for a client letter. Where at the USCIS side, the memo has been withdrawn and USCIS is not asking for client letter, but the consulates are asking. The standards in the IT serve memo doesn't apply to the consulates. Now the consulates want to make sure that the project on which that you applied at the visa at the consulate, that is still available. That's the only reason they are asking for the client letter. There is no need for a detailed client letter. Any letter from the confirmation from the client that the project is still there, that should be good enough. Now the question comes, what if the employee or the employer is unable to get a client letter? We are responding to those 221Gs with secondary evidences, like an email from their manager, their project documents, their intranet profile printouts. There's a lot of a number of secondary evidences that we can submit, and with a detailed cover letter, we are submitting it, and beneficiaries are getting visas approved. So because they ask for client letter and you don't have a client letter, doesn't mean that the visa will be rejected. But yeah, it's high time to reach out back to the consulate. And if the visas were rejected because of the ban, now reapply for the visa, and then you should see that they should issue a visa on that.
That's a very detailed answer. Thank you, Thomas. And do you think the US Chamber of Commerce membership will help a bit now, or probably now it is not going to help much?
Now it's not required. It was required because if you had a membership, because of the case they filed, all those members are exempt from the travel ban. Because now the travel ban is expired, there is no need for you to get a US Chamber of Commerce membership.
Okay, thank you. Okay, now let me go to some of the audience questions, which will be in the order they have been received, and so there'll be all the topics, right? There's a question on the rather TN visa. Rather, I see just one question. Can I travel to US and get TN visa at the port of entry? Is the Canada border open? I have a valid job offer. Is that right now Canada border open or still closed?
It's still closed. As far as I know, it's still closed. Getting a visa may not be a good idea. Or
okay, that may not be possible, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, then one gentleman said, of course, this lot of people have this question that I-140 is pending for 8 months. Is there a cause for concern? I think what is the typical approval time now for I-140?
The downgrades are the problem. What happened was the I-140s that were filed during October, the receipt notices started coming in January or February. So there was a huge delay. So it is very normal. But if you want to upgrade it to a premium processing, it might be a right time to do it, even for the downgrades.
Okay, thank you, Thomas. There is another question, another interesting question. I think there is some, gentleman who is on CPT and, which expires on August 15th, and the H1B will be valid from 10th of, sorry, October 1st, right? Okay. And so the question is, what should be done during the gap period? Will it be like OPT gap, or CPT is also having that kind of thing or not?
No. The cap applies only to the OPTs and not CPT. So either they should move to another non-immigrant status, or they should be enrolled in another course, or if they want to continue their studies. But the F1 validity should be there until October 1st for them to get a change of status. If not, you can request the H1B to be approved as a consular processing and then get the stamping and come back.
Okay, thank you. I think that looks pretty clear answer. Okay. And, then there was a question related with the, can the employee in India go for stamping since the H1, since he has approved H1? That's fine. I think now
it's
it is all
possible.
open, right?
Yes.
There's no problem. Mhm. Okay. So if CPT from states 20 hours, if CPT form states 20 hours, can the student work for less than 20 hours per week?
It's a part-time CPT that is approvable. So if it says 20 hours, they have to minimum meet 20 hours on that. If it's a full-time,
Okay.
they should work at least 35 hours.
Okay, that's, I think, very clear answer from that angle. That's good. Okay. And, then this question, I think you already answered. The question was, after picked in the lottery, if there's a denial for a candidate. No, this is a little different. And can we apply another petition for the same candidate within the 3 months period? So what he's saying is that if he applies an H1 now and it gets denied and 90 days are not still over, can he reapply?
Yes, he can do it. So the multiple filing is possible only in this scenario, where the original got denied and then the beneficiary is filing another within that 90 days, provided the first denial was not for any fraud or misrepresentation. So if it was a straight denial for specialty occupation or anything, as long as you can overcome that reasons for denial, you can resubmit before that 90 days. Refile, I would say. That is legally allowed. Original denial should not be for fraud and misrepresentation.
Okay, thank you, Thomas. Another question, a little complex one. Can you talk about the scenario of changing employer as H1B is picked from second company, but using the project from last employer to file the petition? I didn't get the question itself, rather.
Yes.
So basically, my feeling is that question may be that he's got picked up in the lottery, okay, from an employer he's not working with, right? Okay. Mm-hmm. So probably he wants to use the same project which is the current employer, right? Okay. Can he do that? I mean, of course, if his employer is ready to give the project to the other company, he should be able to do that.
Obviously, if they can have a chain of contract with that company through whom it is picked up, yes, he can file with the existing project.
Yeah. Okay. I think that's a good answer, right? Okay. Because if he has a project and his employer agrees, current employer agrees to join hand with the new employer,
yes.
So, so both will be happy, right?
Yes.
Okay. A lot of people have asked the same question, which I think you already explained, that there is a second chance of lottery happening, right? Okay, which is
keep the fingers crossed. Yes, there should be a second lottery.
So I think that also you ordered. Sam, you have any more questions? I think I've tried to, answer more or less. I don't want to ask a repetitive question. Yeah, there is one question over here.
Can I change some on your WhatsApp?
Okay, I'll see. Can I change my visa to J1? I'm an F1 grad student doing OPT in the US right now. And if I can, what is the process to do so?
You can file for a change of status or to J1. Just talk to the sponsor. I don't know if it is a university, hospital, or whatever. Then they will help you with that. Yes, it is a possibility. You can file it here.
Okay. And he's also another question that his wife is also a student probably on F1. Can she go on her F2 and then she can keep working? No, he can't continue on the OPT based on F2, right?
No. If you file for an F2 and it's approved, then they cannot work on a F2.
Okay.
F2 can go to college. They can continue their studies, but not work.
Okay, they cannot work, right?
Yes, they can work.
Okay. There's another question. What if LCA is approved with address 1 and the employee has to move to address 2, which is 200 miles away? In what scenario we can avoid filing new LCA in this COVID situation?
I mean, 200 miles may not be within the same MSA. So you will have to file an amendment in that scenario. There's a short-term placement exception there, but it's not as easy as it sounds. So if the employment is less than 30, or there is 30 days exception and 60 days exception, but that may not work in this scenario, because if for a short-term placement to happen, the employee should be having a permanent residence at a different location, and he should be maintaining that. The employer should be paying for the relocation. Though we all use it frequently, saying there is a 30 days or a 60-day exception is there. There are other conditions for Department of Labor to come for a person to fall under that exception. So I don't know about, I don't have more facts on this, but if it falls under the short-term exception, yes, it's possible, because if he's going for a short-term project, like a project implementation somewhere and coming back here, to his home location, it is fine. If not, you will have to do an amendment.
Okay, thank you, Thomas. Very detailed answer. There's another question, I think, which a lot of people ask: can we run payroll for H1B if he's in India and working remotely?
I mean, there is nothing wrong in doing a payroll for a person who is not in the US. As long as you're paying taxes, they're happy. Government is always happy. And if you are treating him as a contractor, and then there are other ways to do that. It's just for the tax purpose alone. So you should talk to your CPA and see, because being an attorney, I cannot give you that tax advice. But the answer is yes, it is possible while they are outside the US to run the payroll.
This guy has a question again on duplicate, this thing. This is again, these two questions are from Facebook, Thomas, just for your reference. I just got this feed from the Facebook actually. So if H1B registration filed for same candidate by two companies of same owner, right? So same owner has two companies and both registration got selected. Candidate is same, right? If candidate confirms to one company and doesn't want to move ahead with the, that company, other company, then the company he is not filing, is he liable to answer to USCIS, right?
So the duplicate registrations and duplicate filings, to file H1B filing is two different things. So in this case, the regulations restricts only duplicate registration by the same employer. It doesn't restrict another company. It's a different FEI, and though the owners are same, from filing a duplicate registration. Now they both got picked up. Now the issue comes if one of the company doesn't file the petition. When you're doing a registration, you're attesting to two things. One is that all the information you provided is true and correct. Second is, if selected, you will file the petition. That is under the penalty of perjury. The employer is attesting and giving the name out there for registration. Now you don't file it. USCIS says that if there is a pattern of abuse, then that the employer is not filing a petition, then they will have civil and criminal consequences. So if somebody doesn't file after getting selected, and if they see a pattern that has happened, then yes, you will be answerable as you asked. Yes.
There are some questions related to Thomas regarding 485. They are filed and they want to travel to US, right? There could be multiple, they want to travel outside US.
Yes.
There could be multiple situation, like the fingerprinting has been done, right?
Mhm.
Okay. And then can they travel? Will their 485, the change of status will stay, or they need to stay in, the country itself, right? They have not still got the advance parole. That's what I understand, right?
Yes. I mean, I would suggest, if it's a possibility, wait for the biometrics to be done if you're traveling outside, and get the advance parole to travel. Especially if you need an H-1B visa stamp to be stamped on the passport, because you're running the risk of getting stuck in India. And if the biometrics comes here, then you have a problem of abandonment. USCIS will treat this as abandoned and it will deny. Now, that is one possible scenario. But if you have a stamping and you are coming back to the same employer, you're okay. You can travel and come back, even if the biometrics you have not given. The advance parole will be denied, EAD will be approved, but you can come back and refile the advance parole.
Thank you, Thomas. And I think I am also surprised. We had other 400 participants today and hundreds of questions, but I'm trying to select as many as I can. Looks like you're very famous, and that's why people are asking so many questions, right? Okay, right.
I do my best.
Okay.
Thank you, Thomas. And also for all audience, sorry if we missed out any of your specific questions, but we have a habit of capturing all the questions and then, trying to pass it to our attorneys and see if they or somebody from their team can respond to you.
So I will still ask some couple of questions, Thomas, if you don't mind, right? Okay.
No problem.
So there's a question from a PhD student who is about to graduate without a job offer file for green card. Without a job offer, no, can he file? He's a PhD student. Can he file a green card without a job offer?
He can do that. It all depends on various factors. As an extraordinary ability, there is a EB1A category that he could file, or even an O1 also, there's an opportunity for him to file. How many publications he has done, what are the recognitions that he has got. So there are a lot of factors into that. There is a possibility on that. I would ask him to reach out to an attorney. Even our office, our Princeton office, does the EB1s and O visas a lot. So we will be able to help you.
Thank you, Thomas. There are again related question to, the working within 40 miles of the, same, location, and also, basically, so I will repeat, put up this question like this. There is a gentleman says that, he has some employee working from the office. If there is a change in client and no change in job duties, but no change in the, as such, the location of working, that means he's going to work from office only. Does he need to file any amendment, right? The client has changed, yes, but he's going to work from the office only. And there's no material change in terms of job duties and all that, right?
So we are looking at two scenarios. One is the Simeo case that came out, which says that if the change is within the MSA, Metropolitan Statistical Area, you don't have to do an amendment. That's a separate thing. It doesn't apply to this because there is no change in the MSA. The second, the rule is that if there is a material change, then you have to do an amendment. These two things are too different. Now, we can argue as an employer saying that it's just a change in the client. The job duties are the same. The title is the same. The salary is the same. Everything is the same. So it is not a material change. USCIS can come back and say that it is a material change. The client change, the project change. So it is a material change. So that's a risk the employer will be taking if he is not filing for an amendment. maybe because it's a gray area, he can play around. There might not be any punitive actions from the USCIS, but you will looking at a denial of the H1. And there are many cases where there is a site visit and the project has ended, and the employer tells that he has moved to a different client, and everything is the same. The officer still issues an intent to revoke on the H1s, and now we have got it approved, but there are some denials too. So that's the risk when you are not doing an amendment when the client changes, because the material change has not been defined anywhere, and it can be left to their interpretation on the other side by USCIS and on our side too. So,
there's another interesting question, Thomas, related to this only, and that is that, if the employee was working from home location, MSA is for that home location, and the client also in the same MSA, but he moved to work remotely from another state. Do they need to file the amendment?
Yes,
right?
100%, because here the matter of Simeo case comes into play. So now he asked. You said the MSA didn't change, or it changed?
No, basically he was working from his home, and he also, and his home location and the client location was in the same MSA. But then let's say he was in New Jersey and he decided, okay, I'm going to now move to Texas and work remotely from there, right? Okay. In that case, because he has moved out of the MSA, right?
Yes, then you have to do an amendment. Just sometimes two states can have the same MSA too. So that's what I was saying. In New York and New Jersey, some portion are in the same MSAs.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
So another interesting question from L1 to H1 transfer case. Beneficiary already finished 5 years on L1B, now converting to H1B. Can he still has 6 years, or he will get only 1 year?
If he, again, the completion of 5 years, right? If there is any gap of more than 1 year in between that 5 years, only the period after that 1 year gap will be counted towards that 6 years.
Oh, that's very
Let's
interesting.
assume that 5 years there was no gap at all. Then he will get only 1 year if there is no I-140 approved on behalf that person.
Okay, that's very interesting. So I think I will just ask you, it's a long session. We had 1 hour, 40 minutes almost, right? Okay. So let me ask the last probably question. Any update on the immigration reform bill? And also they're saying class action lawsuit filed on behalf of H4 and L2 holders. You have any inputs on that, Shah? Thomas?
Yes, our attorney Jonathan has actually filed that. So it's in the early stage. He just filed 2 weeks back, if I'm not wrong. So that's ongoing, and I'm sure that we will see a positive results on that. With regard to the Citizenship Act of 2021, the new one, it's a big. It has a lot of components. I'm not a person to say that it will not get approved, but it's going to take a while before we see something, and it's going to have a different version in the Senate and in the Congress. So it's going to change. So I don't want to discuss, because I do not go into detail unless there is a possibility of it getting approved. I have not seen that yet. So we are all hoping that it gets passed, because there's a lot of positive things on the employment side also in that. But that's a move in the right direction, but I'm not that optimistic. It's my personal opinion, but not too optimistic on that.
Thanks, Thomas. I think it was very interesting session. We had almost 400 participants at one time, and then, of course, still more than 300 kept on, listening. So you had everybody glued up to the, session. That's great. Thank you so much. And I think we'll still try to address the remaining questions. So I will now request Raghu, our president for IT Sir, to say a few words before we close the session, please. Okay.
Oh, thank you, Vinayji. Thank you, Thomas. Again, thanks for all your time and all your expert advice to IT Sir members, and also to the entire immigration community. And also, guys who are joined, took advantage of it. Thank you for joining. And I hope, again, I mentioned, right, we may not be covered all your questions, but we will definitely do or every effort to get the response from Thomas offices back to you guys. Thank you so much. And thank you all. See you all next time, probably. Vinayji.
Yeah, and please remember, we do it every month. So it is going to be in the, we'll be very soon announcing the next webinar also, which will be done in month of May. So if you have missed your chance to probably get an answer this week, this day, and we are not able to answer your question through email, please do join after a month. Okay, we'll be again online on this, right?
Yeah, we do these open sessions for immigration community on 1st of every Friday, every month, first Friday. And for the members, every Wednesday, we have the immigration sessions.
Yeah, that's right. Thank you.
Thank you.
And let me
Thank
thank
you,
also
Thomas.
the platinum sponsors who make us, enable all these programs. So thank Thomas Ellener also is our platinum sponsor.
Yes.
Thank you, Thomas, for supporting us. And then we have CPAL and, Vital Global and, what is the other one? CPAL, Vital Global, Thomas Ellen, and fourth one is AIS, right? Okay. Thank you, AIS, for all your sports, right? Okay.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you, Thomas.
Thank you.
See you.
Bye.